that. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to invite you to this conference, to this webinar on open science, community-based research, the UNESCO Open Science webinar. And I do hope that this discussion is going to be of a lot of benefit, especially for us in the developed world. There is still a lot that we need to contribute. And for us to contribute, we need a mechanism in academia and in research which acknowledges all forms of knowledge. And not only all forms of knowledge, but all manners of academy and all manners of presentations. I know we are going to discuss issues in relation to open access, which allows for publications. And then that would enable us to have access to knowledge which may not be accessible on account of maybe limited finances, especially for us scholars in the global south. And if that is done, then it will enhance our participation into the global knowledge society. And for that, we would like to thank UNESCO and contribute to the ideas of open science. There are quite eminent presenters, which I will be shortly asking Professor Bird to introduce them. And once they get started with the discussions, enlightened, and would make a contributions. And from this, I believe the outcome will inform the UNESCO Open Science agenda, which is for our benefits. We have been working on issues of knowledge democracy together with BIRD for a long time. And I believe the idea of open science also contributes to that. So I would like to say you are all most welcome as we wait for other people to join in. We have not done a round of introduction, but I would request that as you speak, you introduce yourself. I am Dr. George Penjuru, the Vice Chancellor of Gulu University in Uganda, in East Africa. And I'm happy to be hosting you in this particular webinar. Thank you very much. May I now invite Professor Bird to introduce the eminent scholars who are going to do presentation. One of whom is coming from Gulu University. Unfortunately, she is not very fine as we speak now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Openjordu, for your opening remarks and for agreeing to moderate this important session. I'd like to ask first. I would like to ask Ms. Serwah Nerguaye-Tetteh, who is the Secretary General of the Ghana National Commission for UNESCO, who is the Ghana National Commission, are co-hosts of this webinar. I would like to ask her to give some words of welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hall. Distinguished resource persons, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of my colleague, Secretaries General in Africa, I'd like to welcome you all to this program, which is, as you have already said, being co-hosted, originally hosted through the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, who have so graciously involved us. Yet another example of the important North-South cooperation that we need not only in UNESCO affairs, but more often and more importantly now in open science. As you may be aware, and I think Professor Openjuru alluded to this, UNESCO has solicited the views of member states to develop recommendations on open science for adoption during the 41st General Conference. Now, to be sure that these views are well discussed and there is consensus, discussions like this are very important. And it is in this light that we really welcome this this opportunity for this webinar. And we have to congratulate you and your outfit as well, Professor Howard, because this is what the UNESCO chairs in its very essence stands for. We have lived in a world previously where knowledge was weaponized and it belonged to only a few. Thankfully, we have turned the curve and the importance of knowledge sharing and picking from each nation and each people the different indigenous language knowledge has been highlighted. It is for this reason that I am particularly happy, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. In Africa, we witnessed how the use of indigenous knowledge came to the fore in ways to alleviate the pain and the suffering of people who had been affected by COVID-19. We also saw how knowledge sharing was at its peak as scientists all over the world freely shared what they knew about the coronavirus to make sure that everyone was helping and was helped. But should it end there? What are the advantages of open science and the decolonization of knowledge? What do we stand to gain, not just from an Africa as a receiver point of view, but also an Africa as a giver of knowledge point of view? These are important conversations, and I have looked at the list of experts who are speaking today, and I have no doubt that we will have a very good conversation indeed. I congratulate you all for your hard work in putting this together, and I'd like to wish us all a successful meeting. Thank
you. Thank you very much. Perhaps we could ask people to mute their microphones if you're not speaking. Thank you so very much for those words. Your comment about knowledge being weaponized is a powerful image, and the continuing role of Africa in providing knowledge is important. I'm going to shortly present some background on the UNESCO brief itself, but those will be followed by two contributions from two very distinguished scholars. Quite a lot of the Zoom world is a difficult world. The first scholar after my presentation will be Dr. Okunini Obadele Kambon from the Institute of African Studies in Ghana, at the University of Ghana. A very distinguished scholar and has done a lot of thinking on decolonization, and we're looking forward to hearing from him. And he will be followed by my good friend Dr. Ada Peter, who is responsible for international relations at Covenant University, a really outstanding university in Nigeria. And following that, we'll have an open discussion. So let me try to share the screen. Always a bit of a frightening event, but let me try to share this PowerPoint. I'll try and do that. Here we go. There we go. It looks like, yes, I can see it. So as Professor Openjuru and as our distinguished Secretary General from Ghana has said, UNESCO is in the process of creating a recommendation. A recommendation in UNESCO language means a normative statement that will be agreed upon by the 197 nation states. And it's this, in this case, of course, it's a normative statement about the importance, the definition, and the action to be taken in the name of open science. And today's conversation is part of the consultation, and a report will be taken from today's conversation, and it will be presented. It will be sent to Paris to the drafting team who are working on the text of the recommendation. And as a contribution to the discussion, the Canadian Commission for UNESCO and the UNESCO Chair on Community-Based Research have presented a number of ideas, which the goal of which is to broaden the idea of openness from just mere sharing of texts to the sharing much more deeply. So let me go through there. So we acknowledge in this presentation the lands of the indigenous peoples where we are privileged to live and work. We're grateful to the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, to all of our universities and organizations, and we acknowledge all of those with whom we work, sharing knowledge for a better world. This particular brief, which many of you will have copies of, but is available, we'll make sure everybody has a copy after this, was prepared by Leslie Chan from the Knowledge Equity Lab, by myself, by Florence Piron from Laval, by Rajesh Tandon from India, and by an indigenous scholar, Wanotsa Lorna Williams. And the message here is open to what? We're speaking of open science. Open to what? And our call is that it has to include, but go beyond text and data sharing. It's not enough just to have open access, because what if we have open access to knowledge, but the only knowledge that we have open access to is, Eurocentric knowledge, which is already, very well spread. So we're talking about moving beyond simply the open access, although that's very important. We're talking about open to community and movements, and we're talking about openness to previously excluded knowledges, African indigenous knowledge from other parts of the world, and the knowledges of ordinary, women and men struggling in their daily lives, to make a better world. As Amma has said, we have learned a lot during COVID, and hopefully some of the lessons we've learned during COVID will be able to carry on into a new architecture of knowledge. So we've had a lot of public debates. There's been a lot of discussion about the impact of COVID on public welfare. There's been an emergence of hybrid knowledge structures which combine university type people and scientists and ordinary people working on issues of health. And it as Amma has said, it's included the recognition of excluded knowledges, which in many cases and in many parts of the world have made the difference between survival and not. So the openness, you can't separate the different, one openness from another. They are all intersecting. And so if you have an openness around text, then it has to be text about all of the knowledges of the world, not just the Eurocentric, not just the 500-year-old, what they call the Western canon, but it has to be sharing of text and data from all of the epistemologies that exist all over the world. It has to be an openness to place-based knowledge. As we know, most knowledge in the world is not created in academies. Most of the knowledge in the world is created by ordinary people in the context of trying to survive and trying to make their lives better. And it has to be an openness to excluded knowledge systems, or what we call knowledge equity. What are some of the actions that the brief that we're calling for? There are many actions that would be appropriate, and George has given us a few, and Amma has given us some others. Well, we need to support the co-construction of knowledge with communities. That we have to. We need a new partnership between academics and communities, and Gulu University is a great example of how that's happening in a practical way. We need money. Again, George has told us about this. We need money to fund indigenous and global South knowledge sharing. We need to diversify the publication boards. The gatekeepers of the journals and the editorial boards and publishing houses are dominated mostly by white males, white European, North American males. They need to be diversified so that people coming from other networks, other parts of the world will get through those gates. And we need, of course, to decolonize our research and teaching in higher education. It's no longer sufficient to build a university in any part of the world that is based solely on the European knowledge. And we need to share knowledge using creative forms, dance, music, theater, the arts. All of these are ways that we can communicate. The recommendation timeline is that we are involved now in the webinar, in the consultations, is actually March 2021. There's a typo in my slide, I'm sorry. In March of 2021, the draft will be discussed by the executive committee by UNESCO, and then in about a year from now, it'll be adopted. So there is plenty of time for us to have our views known, and for you individually, if you've got thoughts on ideas after hearing the conversation today, if you've got thoughts on ideas that should be included in an open science recommendation, you're very free to contact your national commissions for UNESCO and let them know of your interest. So what can we do? What can we do? Well, we can share the brief. We can share the recording that we're doing today. We can share the written brief, which we will make sure you all have. We can ask our UNESCO national commissions to support these considerations, and we can organize discussions about open science and the decolonization of knowledge in our universities. And so thank you very much. I'll try to get out of this now. Let's see. Maybe if I close that and I put this on. Yeah, okay. So that gives us a bit of an overview about where the debate is right now, and sets the table. So I think we will, with no further ado, it's my pleasure to call on Dr. Okunini Obadele Kambon, sir, for your reflections.
All right, can I be heard?
You can.
Okay, yeah. Great. And I'm also going to share my screen. Can you all see my slideshow, my PowerPoint?
Yes, it is. Oh, great.
All right, so we're starting off with the great ancestor, and I'll try to be brief. I have quite a lot I'd like to cover, but I'll try to be brief to meet that 10 minutes. So I'm starting off with the words of the great ancestor, or grandcestor, as we may call him, Nana Bantu Steve Biko, who says the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And we're looking at open science beyond open access, for and with communities, a step towards a decolonization of knowledge. And I'm going to focus on what knowledge needs to be decolonized. So there's a quote by Nana Carter G. Woodson, the author of Miseducation of the Negro. He says, "Every man has two educations, that which is given to him and the other that which he gives himself. Of the two kinds, the latter is by far the more desirable. Indeed, all that is most worthy in man he must work out and conquer for himself. It is that which constitutes our real and best nourishment. What we are merely taught seldom nourishes the mind like that which we teach ourselves." And there's a quote ascribed to Nana Harriet Tubman. The historicity of it is, perhaps disputed, but I think it's powerful nonetheless. It says, "I freed thousands of slaves. I could have freed thousands more if they had known they were slaves," right? The first time that is recorded is 1993, however. So as we're dealing with decolonization of knowledge, one, I'd like to deal with what knowledge needs to be decolonized. And we'll deal a little bit with spatial and temporal concepts of knowledge, and also deal with functions of knowledge, one of which is ensuring collective survival, pursuing collective interests, maximization of the potential of members, and then solving collective problems. So as African people, when we're talking about decolonization of knowledge, it's not necessarily because that's what's trendy to talk about. We need to think about it in terms of how does open access to knowledge or any of these types of things ensure our survival, so forth and so on. Now, going to spatial decolonization, or as some of us may call it, de-whitenization of knowledge. Sometimes we can even look at our spatial orientation. So if you look at the Mercator projection map, you'll see that, Greenland looks the size of Africa, right? You'll see so-called Europe is central. And I say so-called Europe because looking at any of these maps, you can see that Europe is a figment. It's a figment of imagination, that there is no ocean between Europe and Asia. This is one landmass called Eurasia. Europe is no more of a continent than West Africa is a continent. However, through falsification of reality and manipulation of imagery, we are all taught that there is something called a Europe, right? And we function as though that is real, even when our own eyes can tell us that that is not reality. So, when we look at that, you can see a correction through the Gall-Peters projection map, which shows the different land masses in terms of their proportional size, their area actually. And then you see the Winkle triple projection map, which is basically a compromise between the two. However, none of this is real de-whitenization of knowledge. To do that, we actually have to go back to the African people who invented map making, and we'll go to Imahu Amenat, the son of Imahu Ipui, who was a cartographer. This is the oldest map of topological interest. It's called the Turin Papyrus map because they oftentimes call it by the place where they steal it and take it to, or after the thief who stole it from our people. And the thing that's significant about this in terms of decolonization of knowledge is that it has a south-up orientation, showing map to mines along a 15-kilometer stretch of Wadi Hamamat. So the important point is that the first map, period, and the first maps, plural, were all south-up. And the reason why is because they were made in the Northern Hemisphere. So if you look at where Kemet, and Kemet is the indigenous name of what they call now Egypt. However, the people there never called themselves, oh, I'm ancient Egyptian. They said, we are Kemetiu, which translates to black people literally. So anyone in the Northern Hemisphere is going to look towards the equator in the ecliptic, the apparent path of the sun. And in doing so, they will see that the sun rises in the east. So Somalia, you can picture that's the east. And they're looking southeast to the rising of the sun along the ecliptic. And for that reason, the word for left hand and east were the same word in the written language of Medu Neter, and that's Iabti, east, eastern, left hand, the east. And the word for west and right were the same word. So picture West Africa, that's on the right hand side. And therefore, what this means is that the south is going to be at the top of your maps, and Upper Kemet, and that one deals more with elevation, but Upper Kemet was going to be at the top of the map, whereas Lower Kemet is going to be at the bottom of your map. because, you know, also in terms of elevation, you have the Ichru, also known as the Nile River in common parlance today. It flows from the higher elevation, Ethiopian highlands, so forth and so on, down to sea level at the Mediterranean Sea. So when we are going to talk about decolonization, there's an expression where someone will say, you don't even know which way is up. And this is the orientation for many people who don't know which way is up. And as a matter of fact, if you show them you know, the continent now known as Africa in the proper spatial orientation of the people who invented map making, they will ask you, why did you turn it upside down? I say, no, why did you turn it upside down? I'm putting it right side up, right?
Yeah, cool.
And these are the terms. So receipt is for south, Shemau, upper Kemet, and then Mahu, lower Kemet, Mahit, north, EIT, east, eastern, left hand, east, and Emen. We may be able to come back to that because I know it's a lot to swallow for some people, but basically the way that we have been taught to think of the world is upside down. East should be on your left-hand side of your map, and west should be on the right-hand side of your map. And then also just in terms of, you can look at pre-colonial so-called Africa, and I'll say so-called, we can come back to the reason why I'm saying so-called Africa, because even that comes from the Greco-Roman, specifically the Roman term, where after the Third Punic War, the Romans called their province Provincia Africa Proconsularis, which is, you know, the province of Africa, which is basically directed by the proconsul. So we can even look at why that term may need to be jettisoned as well. But you can see the difference in terms of the borders and boundaries that we decide for ourselves as Kemetiu, as Black people, versus the neo-colonial Africa, which has largely been determined by Otto von Bismarck and his other criminal accomplices. Now, that was spatial orientation. Now we can also look at time as a line or as a cycle. In the Eurasian worldview, time is seen as linear, which is why they have terms like timeline. However, in the Kemetiu worldview, as exemplified by the Bakongo, time is seen as cyclical. And the idea is that you can look at Luvemba. This is analogous to sunset. Musoni is analogous to midnight. Kala is analogous to sunrise, and then Tukula is analogous to noon. And basically the human being is here at the center looking at the sunrise, come up top, and then set, and then go down into Musoni. And this is very profound because the idea is that every single thing that exists follows this cycle. So you can look at civilizations that have had their birth and their sunset. You can look at human beings who have had their birth and then their sunset. You can look at stars that have had their birth and their sunset, and so forth. And in modern terms, this is what is referred to in physics as, you know, energy in a created in a closed system is neither created nor destroyed, it's only transformed. And the idea is that all you have is transformation, rising and setting, and then eventual rising again, perhaps in a different form, called Khepra by the ancients. Now, modern day science tells us something similar in terms of the general precession, also known as the precession of the equinoxes. I don't know if I have time to read through all of this, but basically the idea is that when you look at where the sun rises at the time of the vernal equinox, then you'll see that over the course of 72 years, that the position of that rising is going to be 1 degree different towards the east of where it was before. And this takes place over the course of many years, approximately 25,000. Some will say 25,722. Others will say 25,920, approximately 2,160 years. And this is what is also referred to as astrological ages. And this was epitomized by our ancestors, the Kemetiu. And Kemetiu translates literally to Black people. On the Temple of Dendera, which is now stolen and taken to the Louvre. But you'll find a proverb in Medu Neter which says, which is life is a cycle. And what happened is that they would make temples, and those temples would be set up in such a way that they are in alignment with a specific star. However, when that star changes position, they would actually change the alignment of the entire temple. Right, and this is quoted by Egypt's Legacy, The Archetypes of Western Civilization by Michael Rice, and it says this was a sort of engineering skill which allowed the Egyptians to alter the orientation of a temple when the star on whose position it had been originally set moved its position as a consequence of the precession, something which seemed to have happened several times during the New Kingdom. So again, not only were they aware of it, they were actually interacting with it and reorienting entire temples on the basis of their knowledge. And then we continue in terms of what knowledge needs to be decolonized or de-whitenized. It goes into who should be known, right? So as we ask that question, many people will know about Herodotus, and they'll say, oh yes, that's the father of history. However, you can go into what's known as the oldest historical document by Heru Scorpion, right? And that's what's referred to as a Scorpion tableau. And this is a good just about 3,000 years before there was anything called Herodotus, right? So, and then you can also look at the Annals of Sarah Jehutimes, right? Which is seen as probably one of the most accurate historical documents and one of the first accurate historical documents in the history of the world. These are the Annals, and for those who are interested in reading, I have the references there below. In terms of who should be known, people who would know of Cesare Borgia, by many accounts, the archetype of the image of so-called Jesus, according to Alexander Dumas Père and many others, that Pope Alexander VI decided to use his so-called illegitimate son as the archetype. Now, there were other images, so-called white images of Jesus before this, but this is where it really got popularized by the Renaissance artists, such as Da Vinci, so forth and so on. However, people will, of course, see that image and know that image, but many don't know Heru, which is the archetype on which that entire story is based. And they also won't know about Sarah Akhenaten, who is oftentimes credited for the development of monotheism, even as a concept. Where it comes to multi-geniuses, you'll have people who will know Einstein, but when you ask them who is Imahu Imhotep, many will not have any idea whatsoever. Or even if they do have an idea, they'll say, oh, that was a villain in the Mummy movie, which is very ridiculous. But again, it goes to the point of who we are taught about and for what ultimate purpose. You have people who will know about Hippocrates and will take the Hippocratic Oath, but they won't know anything about Imahu Hesi Ra, who lived over 2,000 years before and is known as the first physician in the history of the entire planet Earth. And when you look at his features and you look at his afro, it will become very clear to you the reason why many of us don't know Imahu Hesi Ra, right? Will we continue? Many will know about Socrates, but will not know of Sarah Harjadef, who is the author of the first philosophical text in the history of the entire planet Earth. So again, here you have well over 2,000 years before anything called a Socrates, and you have Sarah Harjadef, which is the first fragmentary document dealing with philosophy, statecraft, and things of that nature. And again, the references are there if people want to read it in translation. The idea of virgin birth of a divine savior. So again, you can go to Auset, which is the original archetype, Auset and Heru. And then, you can see after that, it became, okay, let's still keep them black, but, it's going to be integrated into Christian sanity. And then way after that, this is what many on the continent, that's the only image that we know about, and we don't even know the source of it whatsoever. So those who are interested can read Christianity Before Christ. And there are between 450 to 500 of these images of the Black Madonna and Child in so-called Europe. You can barely turn left or right without tripping over one. But here on the continent, the ones who came to enslave and colonize us decided to leave all the black images behind and only bring us the white one. Wonder why? The second oldest philosophical text, Imahu Kagimni, many won't know of him, but they'll know of Plato, right? And when you look at the blackness of his skin and the afros of all of his compatriots there, and the locks that he has, he looks actually just like me if I turn to the side, then it will be clear the reason why you don't know about Imahu Kagimni, but you will know so much about Plato. If you see the difference of the texture of their hair, that will tell you the reason why you're not allowed to know about Imahu Kagimni. And when people talk about the fiction of the global North and the global South, this is one thing that even to find out about this, here you have Miriam Lichtheim, who is an Israeli Egyptologist. All of the information is there in the so-called global North. As a matter of fact, that's where you have to go in order to recover it. just like the artifacts have been stolen and taken to these museums. So, you know, I think that's even a discussion that needs to be had in terms of, but I digress. And then this is what's often known as the oldest complete philosophical text in the history of the world, and the oldest book overall in the history of the world in terms of completeness. This is that of Imahotep. And I really favor him. If you see my locks to the side and look at his locks, then it will become very clear the reason as to why you don't know, and I'm assuming this, but many don't know Imahotep. But then I asked my students here at University of Ghana, have you heard of Shakespeare? And all the hands go up. Yes, of course I know Shakespeare. Do you know of Imahotep? They say, bless you, did you sneeze? So this is really going into the type of knowledge that we even need to know in the first place. When it comes to Serwah Wenese, this is the author of the oldest spiritual text in the history of the entire planet Earth, the first of what are known as the pyramid texts, the compendiums of that, upon which the later Book of Coming Forth by Day, misnamed the Book of the Dead by these Eurasians because they're dead in the head, that this predates so-called King James, but many people will know of King James and his Bible, but they don't know the original spiritual text that had everything from death and resurrection of the Savior to Judgment Day to all of the themes that all other religions plagiarize from later without giving attribution. But many don't know Serwah Wenese, the author of the oldest of the pyramid texts, but they will know of some King James. Many don't know Imahotep, who's the world's first female physician in the history of the entire planet Earth. If we are supposed to be objectively speaking, that's someone who's pretty important for us all to know. However, you know, they will know Florence Nightingale. And I do this every time I teach Intro to African Studies, and I ask my students, have you heard of Florence Nightingale? The hands go up. I ask, do you know of Imahotep? Not a single hand in there. Wonder why? Again, it goes to what knowledge should be known and by whom. In terms of human nature and social relations, people will know about Karl Marx, but they won't know about Serwah Merikare, who wrote in terms of trying to understand the behavior of Eurasians. And when I say Eurasians, I'm talking about those who come from the continent of Eurasia, where he ascribes an environmental reason as to their behavior, which was later done also by Mam Sheikh Anta Diop, where he says, lo, the miserable Eurasian, he's wretched because of the place that he is in, short of water and bare of wood. His paths are many and difficult because of mountains. He goes around on his two legs because of want, not conquering nor being conquered, and he goes on and on. But basically, he's going into an environmental explanation for human behavior. But we'll know about Karl Marx, but we won't know anything about Serwah Merikare. But the texts are there for us to read. Where it comes to first female ruler, people will say, yes, I know the first female ruler is Elizabeth I. And I say, okay, try about 3,000 years before that. That's Sat-Ra Sobek Neferu. And again, the reason why people will know about Elizabeth is that you will see what she looks like. But then the reason why people won't know about Sat-Ra Sobek Neferu is because, again, this is a jet black African from the nation that called itself Kemet, land of black people, and the people who called themselves Kemetiu, which again translates to black people. And again, colonization of knowledge leads to us calling them ancient Egyptians and calling it ancient Egypt. Again, this is intentional falsification of reality and manipulation of imagery. Where it comes to literature, people will know about Homer, but they won't know anything about Imahu Sanhat. And even the historicity of Homer is questionable. However, Imahu Sanhat, we know when it was written about 4,000 years ago, and you can actually read this in translation in various African languages, right? And we'll continue. Where it comes to the greatest female rulers, people will say, oh, it must be Queen Victoria, definitely Queen Victoria. And then I ask them, well, do you know anything about Imahu Hatshepsut, Sat-Ra Hatshepsut? And then people won't know. All you have to do is take a glance at her and you will see very clearly why we don't know about Sat-Ra Hatshepsut, or an honorable mention for Hametnesut T. Again, if you look at her, she actually looks just like my wife, right? And all you have to do is look at her, and that will let you know the reason why. You will hear everything about some Queen Victoria, but you won't know anything about Hametnesut T. Where it comes to peace, the first peace treaty in the history of the world is signed by Serwah Ramesu Usama'at Rasa Tepenra, and a copy of which is in the United Nations. again, this, so-called global north, you'll have to even go to the so-called global north to see a copy of it. So they're very aware of this knowledge. However, those of us in the land of Black people are not privy to it. Or Serwah Akhenaten, known as the Prince of Peace, who has these 4 boundary stela, of which some have been recovered, where he goes into how he will not wage war. He will rather stay in Akhetaten and praise the Aten as the one true divinity. So people won't know about him, but they will know about Gandhi and, oh, he was the greatest, peace, 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 peace. Again, or whitenization of knowledge. Where it comes to the world as round, people will know about Galileo, but they won't know anything about Imahu Weresh Nefer. Now, I got these photographs from a colleague of mine who lives in New York, and this is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So again, all of them, the curators and everybody else who goes in there, can see this depiction of the world as round over 2,300 years ago. However, they're not telling us about it. Again, you have to even go to their museums to see the very first depictions of the world as round. But not only does that not seem to make it into the textbooks, again, where we have these white people shoved down our throats, whereas we don't learn anything about the Black people. So if there's any question about who is Black, all you have to do is find out why are they not letting you know about it, and then that will let you know. We can go to Mansa Abubakar II, where in the testament of Mansa Musa, as he was recorded by Al-Omari on his return trip from Mecca, they asked him, how did you become Mansa? And he said, I became Mansa because my maternal uncle sailed across the Atlantic with 3,000 ships, 2,000 ships for his men, and 1,000 for water and victuals. And when he didn't come back, I was declared to be the Mansa of Mali. So again, you have written documentation of the richest nation in the history of the world by the richest man in the history of the world, who's saying that's even the reason why I became the ruler. And not only that, they left these huge monumental stone, multi-ton stone sculptures there. And this one, they call him El Negro because you can see very clearly the afro on him. What the white archaeologists like to do is say, oh, the ones who have helmets, those are just the indigenous people who have these features. But then they don't tell you anything about El Negro, because this one just got an afro and none of the people over there have afros. So we won't know anything about Mansa Abubakar II documented in history, but we'll know everything about Christopher Columbus, including how he boiled people alive and fed children to dogs and so forth and so on. Or maybe they're not letting you know about that so much. Where it comes to the first free republic in the West, people will tell you about George Washington, who's head of a republic that's still not free, because according to the 13th Amendment, slavery nor involuntary servitude will exist in these United States, except whereas a party has been duly convicted of a crime. That caveat was intentional because right after that, they started convict leasing. And in the convict leasing system, they made sure that anytime it's time to pick cotton, guess what? There's a crime wave. Let's go arrest all the Black people. And that's still the case with privatized prisons. And there was a gradual progression. I actually have an article on that. People can go to Obadele Kambon.com to read that. However, they won't hear about Nana Gaspar Yanga, 1545, who established a free republic for African people where they could escape enslavement and be free. And this is still in existence to this day. People won't know about Tata Ganga Zumba, who established Palmares, or Baba Zumbi dos Palmares, one of the great leaders there who fought against the Portuguese. So we'll know about losers like George Washington, but we won't know anything about the winners who are actually establishing free republics. And again, the United Snakes of a Murderer are still not free in any way, shape, or form. Where it comes to women warriors, people will know about Joan of Arc, but they won't know anything about Nana Amani Shaketo or Mwine Njenga Mbande. Nana Amani Shaketo was able to stop the forward march of the Roman Empire, and that's why they had to stop. And they were not able to conquer further inland. And also Mwine Njenga Mbande was able to fight the Portuguese over the majority of her adult life. People, and this often, comes up, I'll ask the students, do you know Napoleon? All the hands go up. And I'll say, do you know Nana Jean-Jacques Dessalines? Not a single hand. I say, how come you know the loser, but you don't know the winner, right? So Nana Jean-Jacques Dessalines was a military genius who defeated Napoleon's army, which at that time was supposed to be the best military in the world. So how come we know the loser and we don't know the winner? I think it's a common story. All you have to do is look at their complexions, and that will tell you something about the type of knowledge that needs to be decolonized. And this one, I don't think we have time for it, but this is one of my former students who decided to go around the University of Ghana and ask people, do they know about Julius Caesar? Everybody said, yes, 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 yes. Then she asked, do you know about Imahu Imhotep? What is that? What? And this is at what's supposed to be the best university in Ghana. Again, those at other universities may dispute that, but we'll leave it at that. So Nana Carter G. Woodson, as I begin to wrap it up, what he says is that those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from the teaching of biography and history. And this will let you know the reason why we are not privy to that information, because once you lose the inspiration, your highest aspiration will be to work for those who have done everything, which are all of those so-called white people on the right-hand side of my slides. And then according to Okunini Renoko Rashidi, he says, what you do for yourself depends on what you think of yourself. And what you think of yourself depends on what you know of yourself. And what you know of yourself depends on what you have been told. And it's very clear that we as Kemetiu, as Black people, we haven't been told very much about ourselves. Therefore, we don't know very much about ourselves. Therefore, by and large, we don't think very much of ourselves. And that explains the degree to which we do for ourselves versus the degree to which we do for others. And this is expressed in Wolof. It says, which translates to self-knowledge is better than being told about oneself. And as I close out, this is something that I think is very important in terms of the ongoing discussions about decolonization. And this is what I refer to as lessons from entomology in terms of aggressive mimicry. You're like, what in the world does that have to do with anything? Aggressive mimicry is when a specific type of firefly, in this case, the female Photurus pennsylvanica glows, imitating the visual signal of female Photunus pyralis to lure unsuspecting Photunus pyralis males to their untimely deaths. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at sometimes you'll have people who are talking about decolonization of knowledge because it sounds good. But then when you get closer, you realize that this is just a scam to get money from NGOs and to get money from Mellon and Carnegie and UN and so forth and so on. However, they're actually not interested in decolonizing knowledge. They're interested in getting more money for the next conference so that we can reassess and reanalyze and reinterpret and so forth and so on. So this is aggressive mimicry. Similar thing happens in Australia where the left predatory Corobalius leucoviridis katydids can attract male cicadas by imitating the species-specific wing flick replies of sexually receptive female cicadas. Again, you're lured in by the sound, but by the time you get there, you realize that you are on the dinner table. So I'd say to all of us as Black people, we need to be very, very cognizant of this same type of aggressive mimicry, because you'll have people who will say things like decolonize, but when you get there, they're only trying to get some funds from Mellon, right? And when they're talking about, oh, you know, let's decolonize knowledge and so forth and so on. So these are things for us to keep in mind. Is this authentic or is this a case of aggressive mimicry? There may be lessons from entomology in this regard. In conclusion, doit mesdames enseignants wala don après kaka a jerajef eshe asantini sana matondo mamingi. I'm done.
Right, Hall. Do I take on the stage now? This is Ada. Hello, Professor Bod. Are you there?
Sorry, I was muted. George, you are the moderator, so you go ahead and segue here.
Yeah, I think that was a wonderful presentation from the professor, and I think the next presenter is Professor Adapita on the decolonization of knowledge and open science. And I will go on to invite you. We will expect to have a discussion on the rich presentations that has been given towards them. So yes, the next presenter.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Good morning
Yes,
to colleagues in the North, and good evening if you're in my part of the world, Africa. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to the ongoing conversation on decolonizing knowledge systems as open science. I really appreciate the preceding presentation. It was fantastic, and I hope to connect with you. I know July this year, let me start by saying that July this year, Leslie, Bod, Florence, Rajesh, and Lorna proposed to the Canadian Commission for UNESCO 5 types of openness that they believe are necessary. But the openness to excluded knowledges grabbed my interest. In that section, they identified 2 families of knowledge that are excluded from the mainstream or conventional science, as we call it. And these are indigenous knowledges, ways of knowing, and epistemologies. And of course, the second is the scholarly knowledge from marginalized groups of people in Western English-speaking science, such as women, minorities, non-Anglophone scholars, or scholars from the less privileged countries in the global South. I sincerely recall that they argued, that science should be much more pluriversal by opening itself to these families of knowledge that are ignored by so many scientists in the global North. But my big there really is, if global structures and organizations, and I mean UNESCO inclusive, World Health Organization, WTO, IMF, have and still reinforce European knowledge systems and science to the point of physiological aversion responses towards marginalized people's knowledge system. How do we then instigate a movement from the very fulcrum that drives the subtle but gradual art of erasing diversity and alternative forms of knowledge? That was really my big question. I mean, I found it pretty interesting that it was UNESCO driving for open science, but now we're having the opportunity to include and, diversify what's open science means to us here in Africa. Let's think for a minute. Which of the superstructures would employ an individual trained by an indigenous knowledge system? The very structures of the world that we have today are created and they are assessed. You can only assess the structures if you have Eurocentric knowledge. Can you think of working at UNESCO without the Eurocentric education? Or will UNESCO employ, as a director of culture, an indigenous trained personnel whose skills for preservation of culture is misaligned with Eurocentric ways of preserving culture? I bet to say that without a Eurocentric education, you cannot walk, as of what I know today, in any of these gigantic structures that birth the very microsystems in our various nations. Even man's motivation for work, earnings, persons without the existing knowledge system, and I speak of the Eurocentric knowledge system, are almost confined to earn next to nothing. In this same system, solving global problems with local knowledge is sure to go unrecognized, or if perhaps social media makes it very popular, it's tagged as unreliable, undependable, since the process of generating such knowledge or solutions are outside the purview of Western science. Candidly, if we truly seek decolonization of knowledge, I would say that what we're seeking for is the dismantling of the extant global structures as we have it, including UNESCO, is the dismantling of the United Nations, is the dismantling of the IMF, the dismantling of the World Bank, the dismantling of the World Trade Organization, the dismantling of the World Health Organization as we have it. If we seek decolonization of knowledge, we might also be seeking for the dismantling of the extant employability criteria as we have it today. The extant criteria for what constitutes a discipline, or the dismantling of the health structures as we have it today, dismantling of financial structures as we have it today. We are actually seeking for the construction of new national and perhaps global structures. I may ask, is that what the UNESCO is seeking to have? I mean, what I'm proposing is not impossible, but yes, it is difficult. For me, that's the question that open science is asking. It is difficult because Eurocentric knowledge system in these institutions have gained significant privileges over indigenous and other people's territorial knowledge system, where the ability to speak English or other supra-global languages are key indicators of success, if not key criterion for thriving in today's world. Remember, you can't speak English or any of these supra languages, your chances are reduced drastically on the global stage. But care to forget about your mother tongue and speak any of these languages, you're more likely to excel on the global stage. Even within UNESCO general meetings, WTO, WHO, cannot, in fact, just attempt not to understand this supernatural. I mean, I call them supernatural because they're almost becoming so. You can't understand them. You won't successfully understand what is being said at these meetings. They are structured, I mean, this way to continually, in my opinion, reproduce and sustain the colonization of knowledge, to distort and prevent alternative forms of knowledge. And then perhaps they have become indirect but gradual acts of erasing alternative forms of knowledge. How, you might say? Well, in case everything I have said so far is not looking together, it's done through language, education, training, and the opportunities available to you. Like my colleague just mentioned, from your training, you're already colonized. From your education, from the language, it's done. So language, as we know it sincerely, is the purveyor of culture, of human culture. Language conveys education and training, then your training controls the opportunities available to you. So as long as language and knowledge is colonized, as long as the West successfully dumbs down alternative science or information, indigenous production and application of indigenous information at a global scale will never yield the benefit it portends. So now that we see the enormity of the challenge, how do we dismantle open science to accommodate and break the hegemony using the same system that fuels the hegemony? We may want to start the revolution from science, so let's zoom in a little bit on science. I assume that we agree that a small circle of Western European nations provided the original home for modern science as we have it during the 16th and 17th centuries. And I speak of Italy, France, England, Netherlands, Germany, Austria, and the Scandinavian countries. And until fairly recent times, no region outside Western Europe received these modern sciences through direct contact. Rather, it happened through military conquest, colonization, imperial influence, missionary activities, commercial and political relations. But how did this Western science actually diffuse so neatly into our culture? Perhaps if we understand, it might give us or help us gain little clue on how we might begin to spread other indigenous knowledge systems through open science. And my answer to that question of how European science neatly diffused into our culture is because other natives like you and me allowed and accepted Western scientific interpretations of our flora and our fauna. We accepted it, we allowed it, we received it. This mode of diffusion was pretty common with Europeans who visited new lands to survey, collect floras and faunas. Then they went ahead to study the physical features, and with their results, they disseminated, and we accepted it. Now, flip that coin for a bit.
Hello. Hello.
I think the audio has gone out for me as
Looks like she has gone. Don't know what happened. I don't know whether we should wait. The presentation was quite good. It's focusing on the issues. It builds on what Dr. Kambon was making, which knowledge controls the world and runs the world, and which knowledge determines resource distributions, and how that knowledge hegemony still this stranglehold on society, and questions how that can be unpacked, how can it be dismantled, how can it be reconstructed in order to align well with the principle of open science. Of course, towards the end, Dr. Obadele was also very clear on where is the reality, in which he brings aggressive mimicry. So these are the questions that we need to carry forward. How will knowledge decolonization look like? How will it look like?
Okay, I'm sorry, I went off for a bit.
Okay, you can continue from there.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. So I remember I left off saying, flip the coin for a bit. Can open science do this for alternative methods of knowing? Can open science also incorporate accepting other alternative methods of knowing? In a metaphorical sense, can UNESCO, through open science, push for acceptance of others' interpretation of Western floras and faunas? To support the spread of alternative knowledge system as open science, I recommend that the definition of open science at UNESCO should include indigenous people's quest to study other people's floras and faunas in the native ways without vindictive attitudes and approach to accepting such findings. What this means really is that when I study and report on the possibilities of Canadian weather using local methods, open science should also mean accepting these findings as long as nature shows and proves the benefits of my findings to humanity. In my tradition, we understand floras and faunas in unique ways that may be termed unscientific by the European standards. But I dare say that these findings bear diversity of possibilities. For instance, for a crop that European science may have limited to tablets and medicine, the same crop in my native science proves that it's got the potential to change the weather from sunshine to rain. I imagine that this is quickly termed black magic. Open science must embrace studies seeking to show possibilities beyond what the Eurocentric science has to offer. In other words, what I'm saying is that open science should include accepting other knowledge systems without vindictive attitudes and approach. The other is UNESCO must be prepared to accept and reward alternative education. I recommend that open science should include the recognition of alternative education system. Open science should capture support for attempts to create global employment opportunities and rewards for persons who graduate from these alternative systems of education. The benefits are numerous. They are innumerable. I can best explain the potential benefits of this approach of diversifying science using the extensive game tree. Imagine for a moment a game tree with nodes, actions, strategies, and payoff for a moment. From that tree, I argue that the payoffs humanity has enjoyed so far is largely from exploring a subject from different fields. I also argue that humanity would have suffered greater losses if we had confined knowledge to only what one field can offer. The same logic follows that there are many more payoffs for humanity if we open up science to other forms of knowing, like other forms of knowing about a plant. And I believe the current health crisis illustrates my point, because while science as we know it is still struggling to combat the ongoing health crisis, indigenous people cut across different cultures have identified and deployed local science for dealing with the challenge. As promising as decolonizing knowledge may be, I am not ignorant of the struggles we must prepare to encounter if we must establish an indigenous and independent scientific tradition. And this might include get ready to face challenges about receiving most of your training at home, and gaining respect from your colleagues, or finding intellectual stimulations, or being able to communicate your knowledge to others. These are key challenges we might face. But I think the AI as we have it today might render help to indigenous languages that other persons seek to understand. I write in my indigenous language. Today, AI may be able to interpret it to you if you're happy to hear what I have to say. But facing it, as I begin to wrap up, while this challenge is so entrenched, into us, thanks to the dominant discourses, that we've received through education and the media, that now impacts our ways of thinking and talking and representing subjects like decolonizing knowledge system, I worry more about how far and genuine our call and efforts may go. That as I speak, I almost doubt myself and can tell that many persons see my proposition of accepting my local science as a futile effort. However, I'm consoled. Change all starts with a thought, followed by a conversation. Then, as Margaret Mead puts it, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. We have started the talk. It might soon trickle down to the eligibility criteria for assessing job roles in existing global systems. I believe that coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is the progress. But if we keep working together, then we might we might have the success that we all seek. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ada,
Thank you.
for that very wonderful presentation. It actually connects and extends well what Dr. Obadele had been presenting. The take home for me, Dr. Obadele, the take home for me is still the questioning of the existing dominant, pervasive Western knowledge systems. And if UNESCO is decolonizing, you threw in a challenge, the acceptability of indigenous educated people. I have a problem with the word indigenous. That is what I call the othering of other existence, the othering of alternative existence, by naming them, which I find problematic because the so-called indigenous do not call themselves indigenous. They are told to call themselves indigenous. Then you brought in the issues of language and the pervasiveness of Western canon coming along with his own language when the local languages of particular locations are not accepted and can never contest for space with the what is now becoming the international languages like English, like French, like German. And of course, Chinese are finding inroads into that space as well. So it's quite a Herculean task which the UNESCO's open science space need to engage with this contradiction so that they can genuinely present a case and quoting Obadele without mimicry, aggressive mimicry, which ends up often misleading and ends up enhancing the pervasiveness of the presently dominant knowledge. We have already had these two presentations from Obadele. We should have been going to the presentation by Dr. Professor Catherine Odora Hopper. I wonder whether she has had time to come in. Somebody's putting up his hand already, or her hands. I don't know whether they have had opportunity to come in. We then can go into discussion later on. But I would also like to say that on the side chat, there are a lot of discussion as well going on. The main discussion that is going on, which I would like to point out, to bring it into the fore, are still also emphasizing on decolonizations. Others are saying not decolonizations, but de-whiteizations. Others are saying de-whiteization. Others are calling it re-Africanizations. But when you say re-Africanization, then you restrict it, because we have the re-Africanization. Re-Africanization contextualizes it into Africa. Yes, the debate that we are running about is in Africa, but let us also think about the Australian Aboriginals. Let us also think about the excluded in the North, like the ones in Canada. So let us look at the Africa, the global South and the excluded North. I have seen Femi putting up her hand. I think if Catherine is not there, possibly we can go into the phase of discussions, and we allow for open these questions and presentations and contributions. So Femi, are you there, Femi?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor George, and thank you to all the presenters. A very interesting conversation. My name is Dr. Femi Nzegu, and I work with INASP, which is an international organization based in Oxford. I'd like to actually ask that when the recommendations go to UNESCO, that they seriously look at the terminology that's in use. And I would challenge the terminology on the back of what Professor George has just said. The use of indigenous as a group or type of knowledge, in fact, reinforces the difference that people are challenging. And the fact that knowledge is ghettoized, that's indigenous. And then there's the real knowledge, and then there's knowledge of everybody else. And so I think some of these terms would be really useful to look at. I think for sure, all epistemologies have equal authenticity, and they should be able to stand side by side without any differentiation, except in defining them about that particular angle of knowledge, or the theme of knowledge, or the subject of knowledge that they bring. Similarly, I'd just like to point out that terms such as Anglophone, Francophone, Sub-Saharan Africa, marginalized people, all of these are a legacy that need to be questioned by the individuals that are using them. Again, they do not define individuals in and of themselves in their own rights as subjects of their own world, but rather linked to another world. And just finally, a comment that was made earlier on, which is about people receiving Eurocentric education. If you pick up on Professor Kunini's lecture, we are actually not talking about Eurocentric education. We're talking about the foundations of Eurocentric education actually are not Eurocentric, and as such, across the world, you have the right, the need, in fact, the imperative to become more aware of true knowledge. The foundations of what today is classed as Eurocentric knowledge actually has its origins somewhere else. And it's important to be able to give credit to where credit is due across the knowledge spectrum, and to give equality of definition and worth to everyone's knowledge.
Yeah, thank you,
George.
Thank you, Dr. Femi Ezegu. Yeah, Dr. Femi Ezegu works with INAPS in the UK, and that was quite a very penetrating discussions, because it still goes on to, and I like the idea of ghettoizations by naming, and naming promotes exclusion. It means it makes it unmain. It is not a main, it is a category that should be classified and put as not even as an alternative, as an existence that should have been known, not of equal status with the others. So all forms of epistemology needs to be put on the table and taken for its merit, as Dr. Peter had been, Peter was saying. So, and they should be able to influence world behavior and world knowledge going on forward. So I thank Femi for that, Dr. Femi. I don't know whether there are other, there's a lot of discussions going on the side wing, a lot of appreciations of presentations, a lot of, you know, very revealing, very eye-opening discussions going on. I don't know if there is anybody who has a hands up, who would like to say something on this. The presenters are already over. Professor Catherine Odora Hopper says he will provide his submission later on, but he is also a person who attests to the issues of what they call avoidance of epistemicide. You know, that should be epistemological revolution, so that all knowledges can come forward to inform world life, to inform humanity, instead of being put classified. And in Africa, they go to the extent of demonization of existing knowledge practice by the Western. What is going on? Hello? Mandarin is making noise. Thank you for putting off. Anybody has a submission? Dr. Monk, you're visible there.
Prof, if I could just briefly touch on some of the points that have been made.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, you know, I think a lot of it really hinges on naming, because I think a lot of what we're referring to as colonization of knowledge is based, as I mentioned, on the falsification of reality, and then also manipulation of imagery. And one example is, even as we are discussing the problem, it's difficult to do that in this very language when we talk about Western knowledge, right? Now, even this very concept is based on a Greco-Roman worldview that sees the Aegean Sea basically as the center, and anything west of the Aegean Sea is the Western world, and then anything east of the Aegean Sea is the Eastern world. So there you have so-called Europe to the west, and then so-called Asia to the east. So when we ourselves are using these types of terms to talk about Western, you know, as in the Holy Roman Empire versus Eastern as the Byzantine Empire, we ourselves are buying into what is really a fiction, because the Aegean Sea isn't the center of anything. So I think that just the terms that we use and that over the decades we have been using are in and of themselves obfuscatory in terms of really covering up what exactly it is that we're dealing with. Another issue is with the term Global South, right? And this is one that I alluded to during the presentation, where it's like South of whom? So I had a colleague who's right here at African Studies who was mentioning, yeah, I'm in China right now, and then from there I'm going to India, then I'll be in Libya, and then in Ghana. They said, yeah, the Global South is coming together. And I sent him a picture of the map, the world map. And I said to him, okay, China, Northeast China is further north than Spain, is further north than the continental United States. India is also right there in the northern hemisphere, as is Libya, as is Ghana, is also in the northern hemisphere. So when we say global south, south of whom, what relation, who is at your center, and who are you south of, and how in the world does that become an identity that you're going to say global south, yeah, come together? And again, this is part of falsification of reality. How can all of these countries in the northern hemisphere be in the global south? It actually makes no sense. And with our own eyes, we can see, but because these are terms that are bandied about, we grab onto them, and then, you know, we pick it up like a toddler just putting things into their mouth. I say that because I have a toddler who does that. But if we actually look at our own understanding, I just want to share this very briefly. This is an image from our own ancestors, and this can be found, if you can see it, this can be found in the tomb of Ramesu Hekat Ilnu, called by the Eurasians Ramesses III. And this image was oftentimes used by Mamsech on the joke to show how the people of Kemet identify themselves. So on the far left, you have the Ramech. These are the people of Kemet, who in modern times we call ancient Egyptians, but they call themselves Kemetu, meaning black people. And they depicted themselves as jet black people or brown black people. So both of these are the indigenous people of the continent we now know as Africa, and the nation that we now refer to as ancient Egypt, which is properly called Kemet, land of black people. But then so we're looking at the far left on both the top and bottom rungs of far left. The second from the left are what are called Amu. And Amu is a term collectively used to refer to those who come from the continent of Eurasia. Right, so whether they be sea peoples, whether they come from what we now call Greece, whether they come from Persia, whether they come from Lebanon, whatever, all of those are called Amu, and the root word of that is Am, which is the foreign throw stick. So we define them as those who are foreign to the land of black people. And then you have the Nahasiu, the third from the left. These are the black people who didn't self-identify as such, but qualified as such, because you see that we depicted those Nahasiu, the third from the left, the exact same way we depicted ourselves, the Ramech, the people of Kemet, in terms of clothing, presentation, cultural, everything else. And then you have the Chemhu, and these are the Amu who had invaded west of Kemet and what's now known as Libya by that time, which is around 3,500 years ago. So the reason why I bring this to the fore is that if we look at our own understanding of who is in the world and how we should identify, there's no discussion of global South. There's no discussion of let's have a hodgepodge of everyone who happens to be South of who knows what, which white people we're talking about, and let's combine on that basis. It's about what we called ourselves. We're coming together as black people, and this is actually a major research project that I'm working on, and I'll pause on this because I know other people may have questions, so forth and so on. But what the essential understanding is that when we understand that time is a cycle, you can look at the resurrection of black consciousness anytime we're in a situation where we're surrounded by non-black opponents. So we find that in Kemet, we find that, you know, in South Africa, Bantu C. Biko had black consciousness. We find that in Haiti, where we said, you know what, we're going to come together on the basis of being black. We came together in Jamaica. Nana Paul Bogle said, cleave to the black. You found that in the US, the Black Power movement. So anytime we're in a situation, we come together on the basis of what we have in common ancestry and common descent, not common South of whoever, right? So I just wanted to bring that. And then my last point is this little thin strip of land is what is called Provincia Africa Proconsularis. this little gray strip of land here. And for us to refer to the entire continent that more properly should be called the land of Black people on the basis of what the Romans refer to their conquered territory, that in and of itself is a colonization of knowledge. And I'll pause on that point.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Akunini Obadele. I do agree with you very much in the sense of naming. Even the global South and the global North, it still goes back to what I call naming and reorienting the knowledge and providing it with a framework of thinking within which we are still locked up. And that is what Dr. Ada Peter was trying to mention. The world is still locked up within this current epistemology, the dominant epistemology, which is perversive. And as you rightly put it, there has been over the years, just like you illustrated in your presentation, subversive presentation and documentation. In other words, recording of history to the exclusions of others that came before that are not brought. But the word subversive presentation and subversive documentation and recording of history in this regard. So the issue is the way the framework is set up even informs the language, and what informs the thinking, as you put in one of your quotations, and what informs the thinking informs the language and informs the reactions, and possibly may distort the way forward. And it is that radical disengagement that we need to seek for. Sometimes I always say, pointing out the facts of the subversion is not sufficient, but bringing up a strategy of getting out of the subversive confinement is what we need to occupy ourselves with, so that we can then bring the I wouldn't want to call it alternative, but call it alternative for lack of better word, that can equally contest for space within the knowledge, global knowledge economy. And that is what we need to do. Just like he says, and it's what I was discussing with my son when he asked, the technology that can withhold rain, the technology that can call rain, and how is it done is equally important, because they reconfigure the physical nature itself and let certain things happen. This is material knowledge, which we really cannot ignore. But the big question is, how can we disengage from this framework? If anybody has an answer, then yes, Jacques. Yes, Jacques, you are on the floor. I'm not hearing you. Please, can you unmute Jacques? Jacques, your microphone is muted.
Absent-minded professor. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. No, I don't have an answer to that difficult question, George, a very relevant question. I just want to put in one perspective. Yeah, language matters, that's what you're saying, and categories matter, which are used in the discussion. I myself, when I talk about Western science or Eurocentric science, I always also have this idea we have to be careful not to put everything in one box. I work in the social sciences, and in the social sciences you have different methodologies and epistemologies. So in my discipline, we have completely scientific concepts about human behavior versus concepts which are really looking at the local and looking at the qualitative and looking at the contextual and so on. So also this category of Western social science goes from Skinner to Habermas, and we should value the different type of epistemologies and try to find a dialogue between the different epistemologies in different parts of the world. And I think as academics, we should create space, conversational space, to have an interesting cross-fertilization from those perspectives. And in a small way, we are trying to do that at Gulu University, to use the different perspectives and bring them in dialogue with each other. So that's my contribution to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jacques, for that contribution, emphasizing the element of diversity without in the process of getting recognition in the global knowledge economy. We should not create another dominant philosophy or exclusive category. Let us bring mutual category that are self-reinforcing, and let us know all that are available and on the table for use, without ridiculing, or as Dr. Femi puts it, without ghettoizing any particular one, or without that. We can still do some disruption, but without pushing the other into oblivion. So yes, the idea of democracy as it is having diversity, and therefore unity in diversity for the good of humanity. Because if you exclude any other particular epistemology, you are denying your humanity of what they can benefit from. So there should be nothing dominant. There should all be available options for you to pick in. I would want to call that the supermarket approach to knowledge, where you go and you have a shelf of knowledge and you pick in one from the different variety that are available, depending on your taste and depending on what you like. So yes, we should not go into the extreme, not become radical, or as it were, become radical Pentecostals, go into rejection of the current and without necessarily even creating what still exists. So let us just add into what is already on table, what should be addressed. But in this, we need to think, how can the penetration be done to get acceptability with the full force that it deserved for it to be acknowledged? So the discussion on the side chat is equally still going on. Anybody? People are appreciating the presentation from Dr. Peter and Professor Kambon. That is quite good. I'm waiting for any hands or any indication of contribution. They were quite powerful. And certainly, what are alternative documentation? But mentioned at the beginning that there should be a variety of presentation, not only one. There can be songs, it can be a presentation, it can be narratives, it can be. So what presentation, how do we disengage and bring alternative presentations, alternative documentations that are acceptable and can open up space for open science, and can open up and let us move away from decolonization and see what else is available. Let us not create a dichotomous perception of the existing knowledge, that you have the Western knowledge canon, and then there is the other one which must also be brought to the fore. No, let us go for multiplicity, not radical rejection. Cecilia Rodriguez is saying radical equal to rejection. Yes, could please elaborate? Yeah, but well, radicalism is extremism and not accepting the other group, even without logic. Yes, yes, Dr. Okunini Obadele. Yeah, you have your hands up. Can you come up, please? Thank you.
Yes, very quickly. There was something that I dealt with at the beginning of my presentation in terms of one of the purposes or a few of the purposes of knowledge in terms of the goals, right? So if we say open knowledge, then the question becomes, okay, well, for what, right? Is it just because it's trendy or what? There's a good book called Urugu, the subtitle, and that's by Nana Maremba Ani, the subtitle of which is an African-centered critique of European thought and behavior. That's one. But then coming to the goals, it goes into one, ensuring collective survival. Now, collective survival, first we have to even know who the collective is, right, in terms of identity, pursuing collective interests, maximization of the potential of members of the collective, and then solving collective problems. So when we're looking at these things, I think it's very important to keep them in mind. And this is why, you know, I bring in the self-definition, because if we look at Kemet, the oldest concept that we have is Kemet-Yu, which translates to Black people, right? If we look at Yoruba, we call ourselves Adulawo, which is again Black people. Now, Kemet is over 4,000 years ago. Adulawo, this is now contemporary. We're still defining ourselves as Black people. If we look at, for example, Bambara language, Bamanakan, we call ourselves Farafin, and then the land Farafina, which is again land of Black people. If we look at Wolof, then you have Reonit Kunyul, which is again land of Black people. If you look at Kikongo, you have Nsia Bandombe, which is again land of Black people. As mentioned before in Igbo and DCOG, again, this is saying land literally of those Black heads, but again, referring to Black people. But then even if we look at non-African languages, then if you're looking at, for example, Arabic, they'll refer to this land as Bilad as-Sudan, which is again saying land of Black people. So even the Arabs who are on that conquered territory that we now call North Africa, in their own language, they refer to this as land of Black people. If you look at the Greeks, they refer to it as Ethiopia, again, land of Black people. Ethi meaning burnt, and then Ops referring to the face of the Black people there. And then if you look at Latin, you have the Niger, from which Negro and other things come from, again, referring to Black people. So I think that this is really key in terms of most people have the idea that we started calling ourselves Black people in relation to white people starting to call themselves white people. However, when we actually go to the text, we can find this as our identity, again, going back over 4,000 years. So once we understand, one, we're Black people, then we start to say, well, how can we ensure collective survival of ourselves as Black people? Because it ultimately comes down to common ancestry and common descent. And that's what everyone operates on, whether they tell us so or not. And Black people aren't the first people to do this. Everybody does the same as well. And human beings aren't the only ones to do this. You find zebras on the basis of what they have in common in herds. You find shoals of sardines come together on the basis of what they have in common. Every type of creature that wants to survive comes together on the basis of what they have in common. However, what we have now is this type of abstraction where we're supposed to come together on the basis of an arbitrary direction. And I really think that even that in and of itself is part of the colonization and whitenization of knowledge. So as soon as we buy into the idea that there is something called a global South, we're already into the colonization right there, as opposed to how do we call ourselves and how have we always called ourselves from the beginning of recorded history all the way up to now. And now we can function with that as a base of power to say we're pursuing open knowledge for our collective because we're very clear on who that collective is. So that was just my brief intervention as far as that goes. And the point of bringing up Urugu is it really goes into how objectivity itself is part of a rhetorical ethic that's again designed to disarm the people who believe in it. Meanwhile, those who are actually propagating it are not being objective whatsoever. So they'll say, let's do objective science and an experiment about how Black people are inferior, but we'll be objective. But even their very choice of topic is subjective. But these are things that I think we can go into deeper at another time.
Yeah, yes, great. Very, very, very good. That is wonderful, Dr. Obadele. It's a great, good presentation. It's an addition, but my question still remains on the table. How do we get off the current? How do we recapture? the truncated growth that has not been historicized or has been archived. It's not even medieval, it is ancient. It is in museumization. The knowledge that has been museumized, they call it Egyptology. It's hiding quite a lot of things, and some have been adulterated, as it were. I saw that one, the Madonna, how it progressed into a white Maria, and I thought that was because there was a material artifact that attests to that adulteration, to that corruption of the ancient history. I'm myself also calling it ancient history, but it was a growth cut short. How do we recapture that growth and bring it to contest for space in the current knowledge systems? Some have not been appreciated. How do we do that? How do we disrupt? How do we disrupt the distortion and recapture the truncated regional development and present it as an alternative that had been put aside? It's a question that we need to engage with, because this is what is going to inform open science. Will it really be open science, or will it be aggressive mimicry that will only pervade what we are contesting? It's something, something that we are locked in, and put into auto drive. And even the language we would want to liberate ourselves in is already colonized. And it informs our thinking, it informs our analytical perspective. I wish Catherine was here and tells us how to disengage in this epistemological resistance or epistemological liberations that we are seeking, not as a liberation to inform our existence as Black people, or inform our existence in our geography, but also to inform the entire world. If alternative medicine in China is accepted, don't we have alternative medicine in Africa? We do have it. How do we bring it? We do have science. They may call it witchcraft. That is where I talk of demonization. So, what is the way forward? Bud is quiet, listening in the background. I don't know what he has to say here as a guru of knowledge democracy.
Thanks, George. I'm hardly a guru. This is the most exciting conversation that I've heard for quite a few years. I'm reminded of my very first, the first place where my white knowledge was challenged was when I was a student in 1964 in Nigeria. As a young white fellow student, I ended up at the University of Nigeria, and I met some remarkable, African professors, political scientists and historians and anthropologists who were talking about Afrocentric history, Afrocentric political science, Afrocentric anthropology, and I said, what is that? I said, there's only history. History is just the story of what happened. And over the months that I studied there, I learned history is much more complicated than that. And it has really very much to do with who you are not, whose stories you have been a part of, and whose stories have been kept away from you. There a couple of thoughts. One is that we need to think how, but we do need to think about how this conversation can continue, because we will get some we'll get some adjustment, some opening from the UNESCO people, but when you get 197 nation states, coming together, there's a tendency for the lowest common denominator. So I think, this is a conversation that the open science recommendation is giving us a space to open up a conversation, but it will not be enough, because what we're talking about is thousands of years, of basically, weaponization of knowledge. And it's not going to be transformed, by one, this year or the next. So the conversation we need to find a space to continue this conversation. One of the things I've always been I've thought so much about is that, Africa is where all human life began. And so the longest story of the longest trajectory, of knowledge from the very beginning of what is, what human beings are, comes out of Africa. And so it has a very special place when we want to move towards, this notion of ecologies of knowledge. If we don't find a way to render visible, that extraordinary trajectory, of knowledge, which is, I'm really thrilled with, Obadele's, kind of short but fascinating, illumination. We work. What can we do? We need to decolonize ourselves. We can start with decolonizing ourselves, and that some of you are already doing that, in extraordinary ways, and others of us are way far behind. But what we read, what we recommend to students in our classes, what kinds of research projects we get involved in, all of those are ways of moving forward. My very good friend Wangola from Uganda talks about universities in Africa. He says, are these really African universities, or European universities in Africa? And that's for others to answer. But each of our institutions of higher education, we do have capacity in higher education to create spaces. Look at what Obadele and Ada and George and Femi and those various of you who say you are located in universities, and you are opening up those spaces. But we need to accelerate the opening up, of these spaces. This, as George talks about radical disengagement, and Ada with her very provocative idea of, we have to do away with, the UNESCO and all of these structures, which are basically, basically colonial, imperial, institutions designed to keep the world the way it is. So, there's a lot of work to be done. What's encouraging is that so many of you, and I'm sure there's many listening now who could also make powerful presentations. There's wonderful. There's a terrific new thinking that's going on in 2020 that certainly wasn't going on when I got started in working on these knowledge stuff back in the 60s and 70s. So I'm very encouraged. I'm optimistic in the long run, a bit pessimistic right now, but I'm optimistic in the long run that the people, like those of you in this thing, you're not going to be stopped. Nothing's going to stop this. It's a movement. It's begun. It's a movement that's begun. How we relate to it, how we contribute to it, and all of that, how we, how we hear more stories. I don't know, but it's very exciting to have been listening. And I think everybody, I really am just so moved by what I've heard today. So thanks, George, for asking me to say something.
Yeah, thank you very much, Badon. I have Femi. Femi is a co-host. You please come in and give us the final word.
Oh, thank
Yes,
you,
Femi.
George. I'm not your co-host, but I'm very honored that you called me that. I really just wanted to agree with what Professor Hall says and to appreciate all the speakers today. I think that the decolonization can only start with African peoples across the world. That is both on the continent and in the diaspora, and people who identify themselves as having a common heritage is what I would refer to as African peoples across the board. So it's not continental, it's not geography, but it's heritage. And just to say that it has to start from the individual, as you rightly point out. And a point also is that this conversation may appear new to some people, but it has been going on for years and for years and for years. And you know, it's been going on in various sectors, various parts of the African world, from the US to here in Europe and on the continent itself. And I think there are numerous scholars that would attest to that, to a groundbreaking work, just as the work that Professor talked about, Kunini talked about earlier on, people like Sheikh Anta Diop, Herbert Ekwe, and all the people that he named. There are a range of people who have been doing work and promoting the issue of, you know, freeing African knowledge systems for Africans to once again assume the positions of progress, the positions of prosperity, and the positions of knowing who they truly are for a long time. And it has to start with the individual and with people who have opportunities to shape curricula, university curricula, and also both primary and secondary school curricula. So it doesn't just start at university, but starts much earlier on. So I thank you for the opportunity to say something about, I guess, a topic that is so passionate to so many of us, and which, you're right, inevitably, we must see actually actualize. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Femi, for that wonderful submission and kind of brief order. Before we wind up, Femi, I didn't mean you to be the cause. We have Hama Serwah of the Ghana NATCOM office, the UNESCO National Commission office of Ghana. We were together here. Not sure if she is still there. Hama Serwah. Well, I think if we do not have any further contribution, I would like to bring this to an end by saying that we have had quite wonderful presentation from, it's unfortunate we have missed the presentation from Catherine, and we hope that when we get additional or continuous space to continue with this conversation, she will as well make a contribution. I would like to thank Professor Kunini for the very forceful presentation that he has provided, bringing to the fore the ignored knowledge, the comparing Socrates, Aristotle, you know, Plato, including Jesus, the mother of Jesus herself, Maria. All these were quite classic and very illustrative, and it shows us that we just have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. And the map, the subversive map, that map does not only show that the whole thing is upside down, it shows that the presentation which we currently have is a distortion of another, and it is presently dominant, and it is what we would need to see to disengage from. So very, very, very inspiring presentations. Peter,
Professor Penjuru,
yes, yes.
if I may briefly before you finally round up.
Okay, thank you.
You have already said thank you, but
Yes,
please kindly allow me to add my voice to it.
thank you.
I was very taken and I got onto my phone to tell a few others who were not on to quickly get on because these were fantastic presentations. Thank you very much, Professor Badhall and your group, because this is a conversation that needs to be had. And I believe what we have done here today is only begin to scratch the surface. And it is up to us. This is the Africa version, but I think it's up to us as Africa to begin to carry on this conversation on our own. And to be very clear what it is that we want out of this, so that when we get to UNESCO, we can clearly state what we want out of this. And it's not just another discussion that is supposed to open the world up, but ends up being led not by the ones who stand to benefit from the opening across. I think that following on from this, I would be contacting a few of the other secretaries general to see if we could have further discussions on it. So for that reason, I'd like to start off by thanking you for lighting this fire, as it were. To yourself, Professor Penjuru, for the great moderation, and to our resource persons. The breadth of the discussions that have been had today tells you how wide and how big this issue is, and how it affects all the facets of knowledge that we hold on to. I'm very grateful for the opportunity given by the UNESCO chair and also by the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, for the Ghana National Commission to be involved in this. And we look forward to further collaborations. I'd like to say thank you once again to all, including the participants, for being here. Many thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hama Serwah, for that very wonderful. I just endorse that, and I would like us to have a take home from this discussion. 3 things. We do acknowledge that there is a distortions in knowledge presentations. That came very well from Professor Pini, and that there is the current dominant knowledge systems controls the resource distribution. That makes it very difficult to disengage with. And there is a need for the good of humanity for us to insist that all forms of knowledge, all forms of epistemology must be accepted. And we have also acknowledged finally that we need to continue this conversation. And we thank Professor Bard, we thank UNESCO Canada, and of course, we, as you have committed, my co-host, we need to get, as Africa, how do we carry this forward? It's a challenge that we have on our table. It's a conversation that we will not need to get lost, so that we can inform open science, and we do not have what we call old wines in new bottles, but new wines in new bottles, taking forward for the benefit of humanity and for sustainable development. I really thank all the participants. It went up to 35 participants. I thank all the contributors. I thank the presenters. I thank all those who contributed. And I look forward to more of this discussion. Thank you very much. I would now like to over to you, Professor Bard.
He's muted.
Oh, Bard, are you there? Bard? Oh, Bard is not now listening. Could have walked away because he is the convener. I'm just the host. We need to go back to him to close. If he's,
You're
I wouldn't want-
muted, Bud. Oh, okay.
All right, there I
Oh
am.
yeah. Thank
Uh,
you.
I was leaving the last word for you, George, as you always do such a great job. I'll just say thank you, everybody. It's been a fantastic for us in Western Canada morning, for the rest of you evening and afternoon, and I look forward to hearing, from you as to, I agree. This is a conversation that needs to be, African driven, African based, and I'd look forward to continuing to be involved on the sideline. And I'm sure I really want to see this message taken strongly to UNESCO to see if we can, really get somewhere on this open science recommendation, so it doesn't become, as George said, just old wine in a new bottle. So thank you, everybody.